Now I'd like to welcome our panelists, Hind Hassan, Yasmine Ahmed, Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta, and Dr. Victoria Rose, chaired by journalist Mohamed Hashem, senior producer and presenter at Middle East Eye, and also the host of one of Middle East Eye's main shows, Real Talk.
So this is the panel discussion. My guests here need no introduction, but I'm going to introduce them anyway. We have Hind Hassan, an award-winning international journalist and documentary filmmaker who directed and presented the doc. Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta, a British-Palestinian plastic and reconstructive war surgeon and rector of the University of Glasgow, who worked in hospitals in Gaza and Lebanon during Israel's bombardment of healthcare infrastructure. We have Dr. Victoria Rose, NHS plastic surgeon, who has supported trauma care services in Gaza since 2009. She's the chair of the RCSE, Special Advisory Committee for Plastic Surgery, and volunteer at the European Gaza Hospital in March 2024 and Nasser Hospital in August 2024. And last but definitely not least, we have Yasmine Ahmed, who is the UK Director of Human Rights Watch with 2 decades of experience as a public international lawyer. Welcome, everyone. Yes, yes, come on, thank you. And I'm gonna start with you. Powerful doc, but I want you to take us behind the scenes a bit. You were reporting there in Lebanon before any ceasefire, so it was basically at the height of Israeli attacks on Lebanon. So behind the scenes, what were you seeing? What was the atmosphere like?
First of all, thank you for the question, but before we start, I just want to, I find it very difficult to take part in any panel without paying respect to my colleagues in Gaza and all the journalists who are there, who continue to report day in, day out, who continue to be killed with impunity, who are the only ones showing us what is happening there and the devastating impact of the bombardment in Gaza. They have witnessed their homes being destroyed, they've witnessed their families being killed, and yet they continue to report. So I just wanted to, first of all, pay my respect to the ones who've been killed and the ones who remain. And I also want to really, really thank Middle East Eye, because it is a very difficult time for journalists. It's a very important time for these stories to be told, especially from us who have the privilege of going home and sleeping in our warm beds. And so the very fact that there are platforms like Middle East Eye who give us that opportunity to be able to report on these important stories and to platform the voices that you've heard today is just so important, and it's becoming increasingly difficult, and there are increasingly limited number of places that allow us to tell these stories. So thank you to Middle East Eye for that. And in terms of behind the scene, actually, it's very interesting, because when I was trying to get together a team to actually work on this documentary, and by the way, apart from me, the entire team who worked on this were Lebanese, including Abbas Al-Baki, who's here today. He's the field journalist, the field producer who works on this, and it's great that he's here today with us. But a lot of them said to us that the reason why they were willing to work on this documentary was because it was Middle East Eye, because they were feeling so disillusioned with, some of the coverage, and they really did appreciate what Middle East Eye had been doing. But when we were there, I think it was before I went to Lebanon, we were seeing these reports of the high number of emergency workers who had been killed, the allegations of targeted attacks, the report of what is called double tap, which is where, as you saw in the documentary, people will turn up, there'll be an attack, emergency workers will turn up, and then there'll be another strike. And of course, the whole bombardment of Gaza has been bookended by attacks on emergency workers. So we, immediately saw the attacks on the hospitals, and then, we are still watching in real time the aftermath of the 15 Palestinian emergency workers who were killed and then buried in a mass in a mass grave. And so even though Lebanon is very, very different to Gaza, it's a different place, it's a different system, different people, but it's the same military. And over the years of working as a journalist, you get to see these patterns and you get to spot what is the military playbook. And that's something that I thought would be very important to explore. And so when we got there, that was what we immediately started looking into. It was very dangerous. It was very, very dangerous. So, for example, the explosions that you saw, and when we went to the site and it was burning, and there were buildings burning, and the emergency workers were trying to work. I've been in a lot of conflict zones, and it's scary, of course, but usually as journalists, there's some way of protecting ourselves to some extent. Obviously not always, but as us international journalists, when we'll go somewhere, we'll stay in a certain hotel, we might have a security team back at base that we can talk to. You can't always avoid it, and of course a lot of journalists do get killed, but in this situation when we went out there and we ended up at a location, we didn't spend much time on the site, we had to leave as quickly as possible, but when we got there and you could hear the drones, they're so loud, I can't describe. They're everywhere. You can hear them at night, you can hear them during the day. And when they're louder, they're scary because if there's an Israeli drone, there's a chance of an attack. And so we get to a place and there's a Hayat, which is the Islamic Health Society, which is affiliated to Hezbollah, and there's also the civil defense. And we know that IHS is specifically targeted. So it was just incredibly scary. There's not many situations where you can go somewhere as a journalist and know that you are sitting ducks, that if you don't get out there, you don't know if you're going to survive. And we had that for a split second. And so you put yourself in the emergency workers' places, they experience that every single day, every single moment. And that's in Lebanon when we got to go and put a camera there. In Gaza, where international journalists are not allowed in, you have journalists and emergency workers just facing that every single day. And I still don't think I can process how difficult that must be and the amount of bravery it must take to be able to do that job.
Mm-hmm. There's a chilling moment in the doc where you're speaking to Mohamed Hashem, who's one of the survivors. He's a medic and he survived an Israeli strike. And you can hear an airstrike and you raise your finger. And then he just kind of calmly looks at you and then you just continue the conversation. But just that specific moment, what went through your mind? I mean, what did it reveal to you about the lives of these medics on the ground?
So that happened quite a lot in Dahia. We had quite a few of those. And just to start, before saying anything, I did speak to Mohamed Ammash's daughter, Noor, who has reported that he's in much better health, that he's doing well, and that they are proud sons and daughters of him, and that they were really pleased with the documentary because I think they were happy that they had a platform to be able to tell their story. But I think just being in that situation and just hearing the bombs fall so close by, it doesn't even do it justice. That sounds, if it's loud on the camera, that means it's incredibly close because it's much, much louder in real life. And Dahia, parts of Dahia was completely leveled. I mean, that was also the place where they dropped those, multiple bunker busters in a particular area on the 27th of September when they killed the Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. But the fact that this family were dealing with what had happened to Mohammed, the death of his colleagues, they're struggling financially, they're living in this home, they're very humble people, and yet there's no reprieve there and there are bombs still falling around them. And they got on with it. But of course it has a devastating impact on them. And it really does make you focus on just the extreme inhumane experience that they go through. And like I say, I think we don't really appreciate that level of fear or experience. almost dystopian.
There's a lot that we're still going to unpack here, but just there's a note that Hind was saying that I'd like to ask Dr. Rose and Dr. Hassan. The idea of drones humming constantly in the background. And I think, Dr. Rose, we spoke about this during our interview a few months back, but I'd like to kind of pick up on it here. What is it that you have to say? Like, do you ever get used to the sound of these drones? I mean, what is it to you when you think of it, when you saw it in that doc?
I think you do get used to it. You do get used to it because you've got so much work to do that sort of occupies you most of the time. And it's awful to say, but I think that the drones and the bombing you get used to very quickly. I remember the first time that I arrived in the March of last year to the European Gaza Hospital, and we were standing in our accommodation, and we'd been there for, I think, one night, and a bomb went off, and the chap that was looking after us, Mohamed Hashem, was standing next to me, and it blew through the window, and it moved the curtains, and I was like, oh. And he said, don't worry, it's at least 5K away. And I just looked at him, and I said, that's really close. And he said, no, it's fine. And everyone else in the room was looking at me as if I was crazy to be worried about this. And so very quickly, you suddenly feel out of place, that you need to, stand with them and just do what they're doing. And then within 48 hours, you're hearing it all the time, and you're just working. It's background noise very quickly.
Dr. Hassan, do you want to add anything?
So just to say that Israeli drones still fly over Beirut as we speak. Last week, the cabinet had to suspend its session because the sound of the drone being intentionally flown over the Sarai where the cabinet meets in Lebanon. They've had to stop the meeting, and you still hear the drones, most days in Beirut. The thing about Gaza is that it has done is it has acclimatized us to a level of violence that has never been seen anywhere. And therefore, for me, moving from Gaza to Beirut, there was a kind of sense, almost that the Lebanon war wasn't, for me, just wasn't as intense. And I even weekends I used to go up to a hospital in Nabatiyah, and during the week I would serve in Dahiya around a couple of the hospitals. And I knew that this was wrong, that this sense of disproportion was a pathological sense, that the depravity of the level of intensity of killing in Gaza means that you kind of get used to such a high level that everything else feels slightly more subdued. But one of the saddest things about, even now, working in some of the hospitals in Lebanon, is having, when you go to the kind of, the lounge in the operating room, and there are pictures of their colleagues who were killed from that hospital during the war. And there's very few hospitals in the south or in Beirut where that isn't a feature, where you go in to have your coffee and there's pictures of their dead colleagues. Doctors, nurses, paramedics, all, because what had happened in the south is that Israel, so one of the improvements in trauma care in both Gaza and in Lebanon was these trauma stabilization points and these field hospitals emerging as a result of the experience learned. And so Israel would wipe out these field hospitals in the south, some of whom it took months after the ceasefire for the Israelis to allow the teams to retrieve the bodies of the doctors. I remember a young orthopedic surgeon. It wasn't until almost a month and a half that his family was able to get his body to bury. So it's a kind of a level of brutality that kind of beggars belief. And I'll quickly end on that. As someone who's had done this before in Syria and in Iraq and in Yemen, The difference now is finding yourself that you are in the front line by being in a hospital. You're not in a hospital close to the front line. And that's the difference in Gaza and in Lebanon. The hospital is the most dangerous place in the war, because that's the place that Israel likes to target.
Just on that note, Dr. Hassan, what does that suggest about the tactics and the intent behind the strikes in both Gaza and Lebanon? Just that note that you just said about being on the front line.
I think it's obvious that the destruction and the dismantlement of the health system is now a critical and central component of the Israeli military doctrine. It's not a side tactic, but actually that destruction. In terms of how that bodes for the rest of humanity, the question is, are what we seeing? So when we started to hear about scorched earth policy in the 60s and in the Korea War in the 60s and the 70s, the majority of the world's population was rural. And so in order to render a place uninhabitable, you had to burn the crops and the ability of that rural area to support the population. In the 21st century, when the majority of the world's population, particularly the surplus populations in the third world, live in urban environments, the dismantlement of the health system is now a component of scorched earth policy. So in order to render an area uninhabitable, you have to take out the health system in a systematic way. And it's critical to understand that, for people who are not within the health system, a hospital the size of Shifa Hospital, which is Gaza's biggest hospital, can probably be rebuilt in 2 years, 2.5 years. But training the pathologists, there are 5 pathologists in Gaza, and you need to know that there's no such thing as a cancer service without pathologists. There are no surgeries without pathologists. There are 5 pathologists in Gaza. There are only 2 still alive. And it takes 5 years of medical school, 3 or 4 years of internal medicine, and then another 4 or 5 years as a pathologist. So that is the number of years it will take if we start today training a new generation of pathologists. Nephrologists, all 3 board-certified nephrologists have been killed. There are no living board-certified emergency medicine doctors left in Gaza. And the list goes on. And it takes between 8 and 12 years to retrain one of them, which means that Israel really thought this one through. They have thought the process of taking out a whole generation of health workers through to the extent that, in order to rebuild and provide a service, you will need a crutch generation to support you in Gaza until you retrain the new generation of just to go back to the 2023 levels, which were very, very low as a result of 16 years of the siege.
Hind, excuse me. Hind, I'm going to come back to you, and then I'll go to Yasmine. So in the film, Abu Ali talks to you. He's one of the emergency first responders. He talks to you about the double tap strike. I want to ask you about that. First of all, how can we define it? Is it that the Israeli military would strike a place or a location, and then as soon as people start to go in to try to rescue, or emergency first responders try to rescue the injured, another strike hits?
That's right.
Okay. What did you learn about it from your time in Lebanon?
It was before. Before we went to Lebanon, we do our research.
Mm-hmm.
We speak to different people. Abbas also did some work on it and some research, and we found that most people that you speak to either have had that experience themselves or know somebody else that has had that experience. And I think there was actually a number of reports. I think The Guardian may have done a report on a double tap, but it popped up in a few places, and we'd seen that it was something that was there. And I wanted to know just how much that was going on, and whether that was something that was happening regularly. And speaking to a lot of people, they said that was happening. But then, double tap is one thing. But then you saw with the IHS building in Beirut, that was in quite a central Beirut location. It wasn't in Lahia. It was in central Beirut, and they hit the exact floor that it was in. I mean, people were killed, I think, in other parts of the building, but that floor was hit. It was a very, very specific. There's no way else that you can say that it wasn't targeted. So as well as seeing, double tap and these like military tactics, we also saw just very direct strikes. And the funeral, the pictures of the funeral that you saw, that was 15 civil defense workers who had been killed in Baalbek. And again, civil defense workers, they are not affiliated to Hezbollah. Even if they are affiliated to Hezbollah, doesn't mean that they can be targeted. It's still against international humanitarian law to target any emergency worker or medic who is not partaking in active combat. And I think that was also one of the similarities that we saw with what's happening in Gaza. And if we just take the 15 medics that have recently been killed, immediately we heard that they were either terrorists or there were terrorists with them. And, that was kind of put out there, but without a lot of detail. So immediately, anyone watching that will be like, oh, there was confusion or there were terrorists there. And it wasn't just, a violation of international humanitarian law and the killing of 15 emergency workers. There were other things going on. And then, there was an investigation, actually, which is rare. We don't normally see vocally Israel saying that they're investigating the killing of emergency workers unless it's unless they're international aid workers. And so, but even then, there's absolutely no acceptance of any criminal behavior. What was said in the investigation, I think, was something along the lines of there were a number of mistakes that were made, professional mistakes that were made, and the soldiers who were involved didn't report it properly. But there was no criminal accusations that were made. And then the same, what we saw in Lebanon when we were there, was that no matter what happened, there wasn't an investigation, but we did see over and over again these videos that were put online showing militants in ambulances, showing weapons in ambulances, cartoons of them being made. And yet, everywhere we went, and it's not just us, it's all the journalists who were there. There were many journalists from all different media and news organizations who all did the same thing and all did their own. Every time there was an allegation, they did their investigation. And there was no evidence that weapons were being carried in ambulances or that Hezbollah was using emergency workers and hospitals to hide among medics.
And Yasmine, I'm coming to you now. So what does international law say about this, if we're talking about the double tap strategy?
Okay, I think maybe first, just to sort of step back, and
Sure.
particularly in relation to Gaza. So Human Rights Watch, other human rights organisations, the UN and many other organisations have documented a series of war crimes by Israel on healthcare facilities and medical and healthcare professionals. What we've seen over the last nearly 2 years is a systematic attack against the healthcare facilities and professionals in Gaza. And we've obviously seen that attack replicated in Lebanon as well. We've seen, in addition to unlawful attacks against medical facilities, personnel and transport, we've also seen war crimes that have happened in the context of the occupation of hospitals. We saw that in the context of Nasser Hospital, Al-Shifa, Kamal Adwan Hospital, and on multiple occasions. And what did that look like? That looks like the denial of essential and life-saving supplies and services within those hospitals. So that's electricity, water, medication, food. We have reported on civilians being shot, including medical professionals being shot dead in hospitals. Mistreatment of healthcare workers more generally, and the destruction, and as we've seen in this video, we've documented many times, also, which is part of the picture, is the absolute destruction of the healthcare facilities themselves. so that they, and the almost impossible task of having to rebuild a hospital when you're having constant casualties coming in again and again. And then, I mean, I think what's important to remember is the attacks are not just on the infrastructure and doctors that are in the hospitals, but it also, we've seen, and as we know, the detention and torture of healthcare professionals. And we've seen that there have been tens of healthcare professionals that have been subject to unlawful detention and mistreatment and torture, including reports of sexual violence and other forms of torture. And there are many, as we currently sit here now, that continue to be unlawfully detained in Israel and the occupied territories as well. And then I think sort of overall, so we've obviously got war crimes that have and continue to be committed, but it also fits into the other crimes and is part of the other crimes that Israel is committing, including, as we have said, crimes against humanity of extermination of the Palestinian people in Gaza, as well as genocidal acts. The destruction of the healthcare facility is part of the conditions which Israel is inflicting on the life of the population in Gaza, intentionally depriving them of what is essential for their life, which is the medical facilities and healthcare professionals, and also the medical supplies that are necessary. And we know that there's, for over 50 days now, there's been another blockade. So I think that's, you know, that's the overall picture of what we're seeing in terms of international crimes being committed, of which this is a fundamental part. In terms of sort of zooming then in to the justifications that Israel has given for attacking hospitals, we've seen again and again the narrative from the IDF being that Hamas is using hospitals as, as a site of activity, of military activity, tunnels and other such things. Well, first of all, it's very, very clear under international humanitarian law, absolutely clear, that healthcare facilities and medical professionals and other emergency professionals are protected like any other civilian, but in fact they have enhanced protection under international humanitarian law. There is a very slim exception of when there is the possibility of actually attacking healthcare facilities, and that is when they are being used to commit acts harmful to the enemy. And let's be very clear. First, there must be evidence that this has happened. But secondly, and this is very important, there must be due warning that is provided and the ability to and facilitation of evacuation of patients and medical personnel from that hospital. Again and again, we have documented incidences where Israel has claimed, without sufficient evidence, that Hamas is operating, but has not followed international humanitarian law in terms of providing sufficient warning and ensuring that evacuations are done in a lawful way. We've seen again and again evacuations being done in instances where people can't be evacuated because they're on either on life support, dialysis, so on and so forth, but also in circumstances where there is no way of people actually leaving. There's no safe way to leave. So I think, and then let's get even past that. International humanitarian law says still that the attack needs to be proportionate. The military gain needs to be proportionate to the damage that's caused to civilians and civilian infrastructure. And one can argue again and again, and no doubt this will be argued before international courts, I hope, and domestic courts when Israeli military officials are before them, is that this in no way is proportionate to destroy the healthcare facilities, given the damage that this does. And what we're seeing in terms of civilian harm in Gaza and deaths in Gaza are not just those that are a result of direct attacks, but the unquantifiable now deaths that have happened as a result of the fact that A, there's no humanitarian access, but also the fact that there is no healthcare provision for people. So I think, it's an incredibly distressing situation, and we know that the majority of hospitals in Gaza have been attacked and or destroyed.
Mm-hmm. And what about the strikes on medical personnel? I mean, the justifications that the Israeli military will put out is that these medics are either tied or funded by armed groups.
They are medics that are not the only people that can be that are the subject of attack in an armed conflict of this nature are persons that are actively participating in hostilities or are part of the armed wing of Hamas. So even if they were a medical wing of an armed group, they are still protected. They are still doing a protected function, which is essentially a function of providing medical aid and services to individuals. So there is absolutely no justification under international law. And in fact, obviously, it's a serious violation of international law and potentially, obviously, a war crime if the relevant thresholds are met.
I actually want to open this question to everyone, to the floor, really. What Yasmine was touching on, these accusations against medical facilities, whether in Gaza or Lebanon, when these narratives take over, you know, what is the danger, especially the way that they become the story? And I'm speaking specifically about these accusations. I can start with Hind, and then we can pass it down, or Dr. Hassan.
We'll let the medics go for it.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I mean, I remember the day or the evening at the beginning of the war, if you recall, when the Israeli army had that press conference and they started to show these graphics of tunnels underneath Shifa Hospital. And then the minute that press conference finished, the Israelis then cut off all communication to Gaza and then started bombing Shifa Hospital. So, you know, within an hour of that finishing, the bombing started to happen around the whole of the perimeter and the houses and the neighborhoods that surrounding the hospital, and including the kind of outlying maternity building at Shifa Hospital. And it showed how critically important, and what is the, you know, I mean, in those 2 months that I was there, just under 2 months in the beginning of the war, one of the most distressing and depressing things is the way Western journalists would latch on immediately and unquestioningly to the last outrageous claim that the Israeli army would make. And it becomes the truth that the Palestinian victims have to disprove. So, you know, and I remember, you know, I mean, even my colleagues who came after me when, you know, in Deir al-Balah, in Shuhada al-Aqsa, the Israelis claimed that they bombed Shuhada al-Aqsa because a missile came out. The hospital was full of foreign medical teams. But that's it. Everybody's job then becomes to disprove what the Israelis are saying, rather than it's the job of the Israelis to prove what they're saying. So when they say there are tunnels, it's the job of every doctor that speaks to any journalist. It was to disprove that this is true. And it keeps, you know, and once it's proven, I mean, once it's obvious, once they released Dr. Mohamed Hashem, who was the medical director of Gaza, because they had no evidence to put him in front of a judge, even an Israeli judge, that there's no then reflection by Western media on its behavior leading up to that point. And that's really one of the kind of most depressing parts of having to live through that kind of the fact that you are continuously having to prove your innocence inside the hospital.
And on that specific note, Dr. Hassan, I'd still like you to expand on this, the dangers when these accusations become the story.
The dangers is so in Rome, there used to be something called the homo sacer. And the homo sacer is an individual whose killing whose death is not murder. And so he is the exception within Roman law of murder, because his death is not murder, his killing is not murder. And what the Israelis do is to basically say that that is the Palestinian health worker, that their death is not murder because they are either colluding or actively participating in armed. And we can see that, I mean, in Lebanon, we see that really most in a vile way with the pager victims. So you know that Israel booby-trapped over 7,000 pagers. There's 7,000 wounded, 900 have lost both eyes. There's over 50 children. I'm currently seeing 30 children, of whom 2 have lost both eyes. Several have lost an eye or amputated digits. The United States is harassing hospitals that treat them and provide medical care for them and threatening them with being put on the sanctions list, despite, and this is not transgressing on international law, that even if they were combatants, once they are wounded, it is the job of every health professional to provide medical care for them. So these are critically wounded and disabled people. If we accept Israel's claim that all of the 7,000 were combatants, the minute they're wounded, they are entitled to health care, yet the United States and its embassy in Lebanon is harassing every hospital that dares to treat them.
Dr. Rose, would you like to add to what Dr. Hassan was saying?
I think it's just becoming more and more acceptable. They seem to be denying the facts of what's occurring, and it's becoming more and more acceptable and justifiable in their eyes to continue. I remember in the March, the first time we were out there, when the Central World Kitchen workers were hit and killed, and we had probably 12 hours where the drones stopped. And I remember thinking, oh my God, they must really be worried now because they've hit a load of foreign nationals that are providing aid. And the following day, it was back to normal, and they had, covered it up, and they continued. And this seems to be a pattern that they're doing, even with the International Red Crescent workers, the 15. It took so long to prove that they had their lights on, that they were performing legitimate work, and that they weren't doing the story that Israel put out at the beginning. And it's exactly what Ghassan says. It's up to us to prove the facts, because everybody just takes what Israel says as the truth.
We're good. Okay. Dr. Rose, I'm actually going to stay with you on this question. I mean, you were supposed to be in Gaza in February of this year.
Yeah.
And you were denied entry? Okay. So I want to speak to you about COGAT. And for those who don't know, COGAT is actually an Israeli unit that deals with the affairs of occupied Palestine. Dr. Rose, you've spoken a bit about it before, and I kind of want to unpack this here. They've basically, since the war has started on Gaza, they've been placing more and more restrictions, which have gotten tighter over time. Now, COGAT, I guess the biggest restriction that they've recently done is that they banned doctors of Palestinian heritage from entering Gaza, volunteering in Gaza. And I think they're also, if I'm not mistaken, they're requiring medics to stay for at least a month?
Yeah, it's at least a month now. So when the war first started, you could deploy for 2.5 weeks. And I think that was mainly the WHO and the United Nations convoys and the logistics of getting people in and out of Gaza on the trips that they have. There's only 2 buses that go in a week, on a Tuesday and a Thursday now. And there's only so many seats on the bus. And as the war has progressed, the number of seats on the bus has decreased. So when we went in August, there were only 25 seats on the bus. And that has to cover all of the aid workers. So that's not just the charities that provide doctors. That is OCHA, United Nations. That's all that staff that are doing bomb disposal work. We had a chap with us on the bus that was tracking viruses, doing all that sort of work. So people that need to be in there, but not necessarily all doctors. And when Graham and I went in August, we were the only 2 surgeons on a bus of 25. And it was quite worrying, the situation when we got there, that was the limit. When the ceasefire happened, we were told momentarily that the bus would increase the number of passengers to 55. And we had a brief few weeks of exultation when we thought that we would get more of our charity team members in. And that seemed to coincide with a period that we were out in the February where a huge number of doctors were going out thinking that they would get a seat on the bus, and the majority of them would be denied. So when we went in February, we were a team of 4 out of 44 people who had got to Amman to get on the convoy, and only 22 people were allowed access on that trip, and only 2 of them were doctors.
And this idea of, I guess, the minimum requirement that you have to stay there for a month, I guess when you're a medical professional, when you're a doctor, it's quite hard to take unpaid leave for a month, isn't it?
It's exceptionally hard to take unpaid leave, because the people that you want in Gaza right now are the people that are doing this in their day jobs, the people that actually see trauma on the ground in London, that are dealing with, massive open limb trauma. And these people have jobs in the NHS. So to take a month off is exceptionally difficult. And, it has been really hard to take a month off and then come back after a week and ask your hospital to give you all your annual leave back when they've cancelled all your operating and all your clinical commitments. But it's not just the timing, it's a million restrictions that they've put on us. You have to take enough water for 3 days, you have to take all your own food with you, you are only allowed one bag that weighs 23 kilograms, you're not allowed to take anything more than that with you. You have to have a sort of an emergency plan, so you have to have a driver 24/7 so that you can get out of the hospital. You're not allowed to rely on the local staff. You are only allowed a finite amount of money to take in with you, and that, for us, that has to pay for all of our, food, accommodation. We then would hire a driver, a Palestinian, to be at the hospital 24/7 in case we needed to leave. We also then, have to pay lots of the staff that are helping us, looking after us. And now that money has dropped to such an extent that we can't really cover the bus fare in and out, let alone the money that we're going to need to survive when we're in Gaza. It's become impossible, absolutely impossible.
Yeah. The reason why I was hung up on the timing is because I wanted to ask you if you saw this as basically COGAT's way of deliberately making it harder for volunteers to go to Gaza, basically to restrict the amount of volunteers that would go in through these kind of stipulations.
I think every step they've made has been to make it more difficult. Every time we go, there's some new ruling that makes it harder for us to stay in and survive when we're in there.
Dr. Hassan, I want to go to you because you had not only a similar experience, but you were recently banned from the Schengen area as well because of Germany, and I believe it was to give witness testimony. Can you dwell on this experience for us?
I mean, I think in order to understand why we're here 18 months since the beginning of the genocide, we need to see the genocide enablement apparatus and the institutions that have enabled the genocide, and the practices and the policies that aim to silence those who bear witness or those who oppose. And these bans were part of that. In addition to attacks on medics trying to have their medical licenses withdrawn, UK Lawyers for Israel, I think, has 64 complaints at the General Medical Council trying to have doctors' medical licenses removed, including myself, with 2 complaints from UK Lawyers for Israel. That process, in addition to the attempts by the German government to silence me and then to have me silenced all over Schengen so I can't make it back to The Hague, is part of that process of silencing that has effectively allowed the genocide to continue for 18 months. It's an enablement process. And it's interesting, there was a pediatrician who had been to Gaza and who's an expert in child physical and sexual abuse. And she was saying that, you know, in all cases of child abuse, whether they're individual or they're genocidal like Gaza, there's not just the perpetrator, but there is a whole system of enablement that allow the abuser to carry on for as long as they have. And when she said that, it makes sense. In order to get away with killing 18,000 children, maiming with amputations around 4,000 to 6,000 other children, 300 children with quadcopter drone sniper injuries with traumatic brain injury and spinal cord injury. You need a system of enablement like any other form of child abuse. And that system is the BBC, is the medical establishment, you know, all of these things. And that's how you can sustain a genocide that's been watched by people for 18 months.
Yasmine, I'm going to come back to you from, I guess, from everything that we've seen in this documentary, the material and everything else. How much of this do you think is a case that can be built against the Israeli military, well, the Israeli government as well? And what I mean here is that a case that speaks specifically to the notion that this is a war on medics and that they are being deliberately targeted.
Yeah, well, obviously there is a case before the ICC, and there are arrest warrants out against Netanyahu and Gallant. And that arrest warrant is specifically in relation to their blocking of humanitarian aid and the war crimes and crimes against humanity that are alleged against them for doing that, essentially collectively punishing the entire Palestinian population. In terms of the specific attacks on hospitals, I mean, I think obviously in each individual instance there would need to be, and I mean there's a growing body now obviously of evidence of attacks, and obviously in many instances there will potentially also be evidence of either there being direct attacks and or it being reckless, of which it then amounts to a war crime. But I think essentially it will be about, I think first of all it's about obviously ensuring that there's sufficient evidence, of which many organisations, including Human Rights Watch but many others, are gathering. And then it's thinking about being able to have a forum for those cases to be brought. So obviously the ICC is one forum, but there are also obviously domestic jurisdictions that also will have the ability to try Israeli officials for crimes that they have committed, including the crimes against healthcare facilities and healthcare workers. And obviously, in addition to the attacks on hospitals and attacks directly on healthcare workers, there's obviously also the crimes that are being committed in relation to unlawful detention and torture as well of healthcare professionals. So, I mean, I think there is certainly, I mean, it will be obviously on a case-by-case basis, and there would need to be evidence against either an individual who has committed it or those that were in command and control. And I think that's really important, is that this is not only about the officials on the IDF as soldiers who are committing these crimes on the ground or via the drones, or that are manning the F-35s that are dropping these 1,000-ton bombs, but it is also those that are in command and control. And so those senior officials that have oversight of this, and I think the world will be and should be getting a lot smaller for those individuals for what they have done. And I very much hope that there is the evidence that is brought to either international or domestic courts that holds officials, both high level and those that are carrying out, to account for what is being done, because as we've said, this is a systematic attack, which is not just about, it is, I mean, I think what's really important, and as has been noted, this is about the individual healthcare professionals who sit in detention right now in Israel for merely doing their job. It's about the young amputees who are who were, for example, in last Easter. I spent my Easter desperately trying to find a way of getting a 13 and a 14-year-old out of Al-Shifa Hospital, both of whom were amputees who had maggots through all of their wounds and who were so severely malnourished they probably had one of them at least had a couple of days left of life. And there was no way of getting them out. But it's also about, as we've said, this is actually part of something much bigger. And that's also where we're talking about these serious international crimes of which states have universal jurisdiction. So they are war crimes, but crimes against humanity and genocide.
You know, a question that gets asked time and again is, why can't we be applying international law? I think we all understand the politics aspect of it, the fact that, you know, Israel is backed by the US and other major Western powers. But at the end of the day, isn't international law all we've got? Is there no way to truly protect it and uphold it?
Well, I mean, I think, as you said, the first thing to say about the situation in Gaza and in Lebanon as well, southern Lebanon, is this is not just a situation about states not upholding international law, either those that have the obligations that are the armed forces and the non-state armed groups. This is not just a situation about that. This is a situation of direct complicity by a number of other states, obviously the US directly, but a number of other states who are directly complicit and are facilitating the carrying out of this, because this would not be happening. And it's not just diplomatic cover that we're talking about. We're also talking about providing the arms that are allowing this to happen. I mean, so there's direct complicity from states. This would not be happening without their direct complicity. In terms of international law, unfortunately, there is no international, police force that can. But international law is actually on the basis of reciprocity, and also on the basis that, as we've said, what this does is it means in this context the double standards that are being applied by the US, the UK, Europe, and many others are then easily applied by Russia in the context of Ukraine, are easily applied by China in the context of the human rights violations that they're carrying out. So by allowing this to happen and by shielding Israel and Israeli forces from accountability and by facilitating this, states are undermining, states who have always been hypocritical, but states who were traditionally the ones that were promoting human rights in some context, are undermining the very fabric of international law. And we saw that also in terms of accountability. We had the arrest warrants and then the equivocal response, some of which was, we are not going to arrest Netanyahu if they come, obviously, and Hungary saying we're going to withdraw from the ICC, and then others saying, oh, it's for the courts to decide. No, you're a signatory to the ICC. It is very clear that if this individual comes to the UK, you have to give effect to that arrest warrant. So I think it is a very serious moment for international law and for states, because international law provides the security for states. Both in context of Russia as well as in the context of the Middle East.
Dr. Hassan, if I can actually come to you on that, your views on protecting and upholding international law.
I mean, I think what we're witnessing now is what we've warned about from the very beginning, is that this genocide is a vehicle with which fascism is going to return to the global north. And we've seen how the complicity of liberal political elites in allowing and aiding the genocide means that they have completely given up on the post-Second World War, even a hypocritical arrangement that there is such a thing as the rule of law. And once they did that, it became much easier for a return of new and old organizations and parties and political movements that are fascistic, that are anti-humanist. So the discourse becomes easier. If you allow the killing of 18,000 children, then anti-humanist discourse becomes easier everywhere else. If you sit and watch people being slaughtered for 18 months, it becomes easier for fascism to make a case because you have gotten people used to it. And this is what we're watching. And it's embarrassing to talk anything historical in front of Professor Shlaim, but today I was thinking the Pied Noir were critical to the re-election of Charles de Gaulle with the members of the right in France. But even Charles de Gaulle, at some moment, made the decision that it either was going to be the future of France or the future of the settler colony, and gave up on the future of the settler colony in Algeria. And I think, and I wish, and I hope that the Western metropole of this settler colony comes to a similar historical moment where the corrosion of all of the institutions and to the essence of the rule of law, when you have a prime minister who used to be the attorney general sniggering at the idea that he allowed a fugitive to escape an arrest warrant, it shows you that a local national law is eroded once international law is eroded. That corrosion and that rot that de Gaulle decided to prevent by giving freedom to the Algerians and ending settler colony in Algeria, that Western leaders come to a similar conclusion before it's too late, before not only is international law become obsolete, but even national laws become obsolete. And we see that already. It is against British law for any British national to join an army that is at war. Yet the government refuses to uphold that law. And it is a law that exists. I think the only country that upholds that law is Canada, but it exists in France. So all of these European soldiers who have fought in the Israeli army, the national law is being suspended, not the international law, to protect them. And that is just an example of the way the genocidal project has eaten at the heart of the ideas and the institutions that were built in Europe, in the United Kingdom, in the United States, particularly after the Second World War.
So we're actually coming to the end of our discussion here before we open up to the floor for a Q&A. However, Dr. Hassan, again, I want to leave the last word with you, if I may. So in 2003, as you were treating patients in Gaza, this is what you said. Quote, "These people are going to be shot at again. Their homes demolished. What we do is treat the symptoms. The disease is the occupation." Now, 22 years later, in light of everything today, how do you revisit this quote?
I think not just that moment. We need to look back for the genocidal logic that existed in Zionism from the very beginning. And I think there are for me, two critical components. Unlike other settler colonial projects like South Africa, Zionism, to its economic detriment, prevented its economic enterprises from becoming dependent on Palestinian labor. And so intentionally from the very beginning, unlike South Africa, which viewed South African labor as part of the resources, the supporters of the early Zionist movement made sure that there was no need for Palestinian labor. Two, the idea of a land without a people is about racial unseeing. That for the Israelis and the Zionists, it was a land without a people because they couldn't see us. They could not see us. And because they can't see us, they're killing us in a genocidal way, because that racial unseeing makes that land empty of recognizable human beings. And that's why it was a land without a people, because they weren't seen as other human beings. And now we see how that logic of elimination that Professor Shlaim spoke about, that Patrick Wolf spoke about, has crossed the genocidal Rubicon. And that now, with what we're seeing in the West Bank, with over 55,000 displaced, the destruction of Jenin refugee camp, Tulkarm refugee camps, now in Nablus, that Rubicon will continue. It will continue in Palestine, in South Lebanon, in the Golan Heights in Syria, and what Benny Morris said that that Zionism needed to correct was to complete the emptying of Palestine, because that was the mistake of 1948.
Please join me in thanking our guests tonight, Hind Hassan, Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta, Dr. Victoria Rose, Yasmine Ahmed. Thank you so much.